Let me begin this morning with a confession. I am not a scientist by any means. I'm not a biologist or chemist. I'm not a geologist. Unlike many of the speakers you're going to hear today and tomorrow, I have no background as a botanist or an ecologist. In fact, you'd be hard-pressed to find any ist related to my name or anywhere close to my name. Indeed, based on my school record in science and probably my seemingly lifelong aversion to anything technical, I sometimes wonder if I'm allergic to the ists of the world. But since I can't add to the topic of discussion today from a scientific perspective, you may be wondering what it is that someone with a political background can add to this conversation. So I'll be the first one to admit that there's probably not much. I can give you a political perspective. I can give you a sense of what's happening on the policy side, and that's what I intend to do today. You know, in a lot of ways, I find some wisdom in the description of the term political science. And if there's any political scientists in the room, I apologize, but that is my background, admittedly. In the Urban Dictionary, there's a great definition of what a political science is. It says as follows: political science, a joke. No such science exists on the known earth. It was once believed to have existed during a short period in history, but real science has disproven this, and now political science is deemed a hoax. It stands alongside other famous hoaxes and jokes like the Sasquatch, tuition cuts, and Ralph Nader. So I'll have to ask your indulgence as I speak to you today, listening to somebody with a background in the so-called field of political science. You know, Utahns have a very strong conservation ethic and heritage and care deeply about our mountain, forest, and desert landscapes. Utahns intuitively know the value of our natural lands and resources. Likewise, maintaining a healthy environment is incredibly important to the state of Utah for a number of reasons, most of which are framed in terms of either health or the economy. On the health front, we largely talk about air quality and water quality. When it comes to water, the focus is on specific sites and their impact on groundwater and drinking water, and we are often able to identify a discrete problem caused by a single source point and then address that problem. The issue of air quality is a little more complex. I noticed that Commissioner Raymond is here from the Uinta Basin. He's very well aware of this. With air quality, there's a much more diffuse and diverse causes and more broadly felt impacts, both visual and physical. So while the impact of a specific water quality issue may impact a few sites or a portion of the country, and so hold up an energy project or stymie a housing development, air quality problems are of a statewide and regional concern and more broadly shared health impacts. With regard to our economy, it is clear that air quality and water quality impacts of existing developments of all kinds must be tempered through regulatory oversight, or before long, expansion of existing operations and recruitment of new ones will no longer be an option. This fact is reinforced by the potentially looming prospect of non-attainment status in the Uinta Basin and the devastating impact such a development would have on the state's oil and gas industry. Just as an aside, the slides are more something for you to watch as I speak. They don't necessarily correspond directly with what I'm saying, maybe just to give you something more pretty to look at than myself. So keep that in mind. There are some that are directly relevant to my remarks, but some of them are just more kind of background. The health of the environment statewide is also critical to the continued prosperity of our tourism, film, and outdoor recreation products industries, the various representatives of whom have repeatedly and recently, in a very high-profile fashion, expressed anxiety about the state's approach to resource development and its poor air quality, particularly in the colder months so essential to Utah's resorts. To his credit, Governor Herbert has pulled together a team of advisors to help draft the first, and as far as we're able to find, state-sponsored outdoor recreation plan, which will detail the state's policy for bolstering those sectors of the economy that depend on a pristine environment. However, keeping this in mind, it is also important to recognize the foundational value of energy production and development in the state of Utah. Utah energy industry produces roughly $4.5 billion in total energy product value each year. Again, that's $4.5 billion. These are good jobs. Roughly 17,000 people are directly employed by the industry. These jobs, in fact, pay average median wage of roughly 186% of the state's median wage. So again, these are high-paying jobs, and those in rural communities depend on them significantly. In terms of direct fiscal impact, the 2011 energy production in the state of Utah generated $323 million revenue for the state. Therefore, the key, as Terry mentioned, is balanced development, and one that is conducted with a full understanding of the other values that make Utah both beautiful and strong. Today, I would like to suggest that Utah is a proactive and conscientious steward of the environment. There's room to improve, but I think we're on the right path. To this point, I would refer you at first to the work of the Department of Wildlife Resources that they conduct tirelessly in efforts to support habitat preservation and augmentation. Currently, DWR has a number of scientists, energy mitigation biologists in particular, operating in eastern Utah. They go from site to site on state and federal lands, coordinating with industry representatives to ensure that local wildlife issues are addressed. The work of these biologists is dedicated to energy and is just a small part of the broader picture, which includes work on understanding species' seasonal habitat needs, repairing watersheds, and addressing problems associated with invasive species. I'd also like to recognize the work that the Division of Oil, Gas, and Mining, or DOGM as we refer to them in the alphabet soup of government, the work they do on the side of site reclamation. Using funds set aside at the beginning of a project development activities, DOGM's reclamation efforts and activities are comprehensive. Specialists meticulously replace topsoil, replant native vegetation, and do everything in their power to reestablish healthy habitats. As another example of conscientious environmental management, I should note that just this last week, DOGM adopted new rules guaranteeing that all companies engaged in hydraulic fracturing post details of their operations on Frac Focus. This will ensure that information about the types and quantities of chemicals used in these operations will be fully transparent to the public. The work of state agencies like DOGM and DWR are significant and offers tremendous value to the state, but unfortunately it's somewhat opaque to most Utahns. While the broader community does not necessarily have much opportunity to involve itself in mine reclamation and other such important activities, state and local governments have convened community-based working groups that have played important roles with regard to conservation. In recent years, the local sage-grouse working groups, created with the support of the state, and there are a number of individuals I believe in this room who have been involved in this process, have produced an unrivaled understanding and documentation of the state's sage-grouse populations. And after several years of this group's work, we are now beginning to see how their efforts have added value to the process as the Governor's Sage-Grouse Working Group, a group which is now on the verge of proposing to the Governor a collaboratively based statewide sage-grouse management plan. In terms of community engagement that produces positive conservation results that balances resource development and biodiversity, I'd also like to recognize the work in Washington County, guided by Senator Bennett and others, who produced a conservation package that satisfied a variety of stakeholders while preserving pristine wilderness areas and other rich areas with sensitive habitats. Such efforts as the sage-grouse working groups and the collaborative stakeholder process in Washington County are touchstones that will guide the state forward as it negotiates the tricky path between economic interests and conservation imperatives. Now, to take a couple steps back, I'd like to acknowledge a fundamental truth that's key to this discussion, and that is that on federal lands, the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, the NEPA process has provided a framework and an impetus for a lot of the conscientious management that we see around the state. Now, some of you may be surprised to hear me praising NEPA, even in a qualified fashion, especially given the famed difficulty NEPA processes offer developers of both conventional and alternative energy resources. The challenges to NEPA are real. As the energy advisor, I full well recognize that federal environmental policy often subjects energy development to unacceptable and overly burdensome timeline burdens that can put project financing at risk and even sometimes derail good projects. And while I'll continue to work with my best to keep good projects moving, I do believe that a responsible and thoughtful regulatory framework must provide a threshold of accountability and a steady regulatory context from which good companies and projects can thrive. Indeed, I'll be the first one to say that the theory and goal behind NEPA are laudatory and noble. Sometimes it's in the execution and implementation of NEPA that there is much left to be desired. I also question the end part of the NEPA, that is the national, the one-size-fits-all approach. While I acknowledge that federal policy offers both benefits and difficulties to energy developers, I have yet to discuss the issue of land ownership, which has become something of a hot-button issue of late. I don't want to wade too much into this controversy here today, but I would like to talk a little bit about ownership issues in the context of conservation goals and actions and what the future may hold. It seems clear to me that the existence of a patchwork of state, federal, and tribal lands in Utah inherently leads to disparate approaches to land management, as well as different conservation priorities and capacities. I'm sure all of you have seen this map before. You can't see the little blue dots, so those are my favorite, the little sitla parcels. Given that almost all of our flagship conservation issues are regional by nature, this patchwork checkerboard, as it's often been called, framework in the state is not necessarily ideal, as prime habitat areas are less likely to be managed holistically and may potentially be subject to unnecessary fragmentation. In order to prevent such fragmentation, the state will continue to actively pursue consolidation options such as land swaps, which potentially offer value to species conservation and to energy resource development. At the same time, today I want to talk to you a little bit about some more bold and transformational steps that we should also consider. On this front, I take my inspiration, and I will quote liberally from one Daniel Kemmis. He's a graduate of Harvard University, the former mayor of Missoula, and the Democratic Speaker of the House in Montana. In a number of venues and writings, Daniel Kemmis convincingly argues that the current paradigm of land management, where a remote and centralized administration of vast amounts of Western landscape has likely reached its limits. One reason for this, he contends, is that the National Environmental Legal Framework enacted in the 60s and 70s, including NEPA, and which are found all across the country, are vastly more common in the West. Or in other words, these environmental laws, while they may be national, their impacts are felt almost entirely in the West. The 1976 Federal Lands Policy and Management Act, FLPMA, for example, BLM's operating framework has no effect anywhere but the West, primarily because the Bureau essentially manages no lands outside this region. The Forest Service does manage some forests elsewhere, but the fact that 85% of the country's national forests are located in the West means that the 1976 National Forest Management Act is part of the law of the West as well, as is the 1964 Wilderness Act. Now, taken by itself, each of these laws, each of the statutory framework of public land governance can be defended as good public policy. Each substantive and procedural element of this national environmental framework is eminently well-intended. Taken together, however, they steadily have driven land management agencies towards what many have called analysis paralysis. Indeed, over the last half-century, Mr. Kemmis argues, the centralized system of land management has been encumbered with a surplus of good intentions. By almost imperceptible degrees, many of us living in the West believe the national government has lost its ability to manage the West in a way that assures the vitality of ecosystems, let alone the sustainability of Western communities. Shrinking federal budgets combined with the gigantic, increasingly gridlocked bureaucracy that is our national government simply cannot do justice or provide the flexibility needed to manage the vast spaces and unique species within this complex region. Further, as incredible population growth in the Intermountain West puts steadily increasing pressure on Western lands, including the public land, the impossibility of a distant, centralized government successfully managing the West's gigantic landscapes is becoming more and more apparent. One result is a new version of an old Western tradition, a spreading and now frequently cross-ideological sense of discontent among Westerners who feel increasingly frustrated at being prevented from governing the places they inhabit. Utah is at the forefront of this effort. In the short term, this state of affairs is leading to a mounting tension, land use decisions fraught with ill will, finger-pointing, and name-calling, while the landscape itself suffers. A steadily growing number of Westerners from both sides of the political fence are coming to believe that they can do better by their communities, their economies, and their ecosystems by working together outside the established centralized governing framework than by continuing to rely on the cumbersome, uncertain, underfunded, and increasingly irrelevant mechanisms. There's an increasing urgency for the West to get on with some form of political realignment that will enable it to assert a steadily expanding degree of sovereignty over its own lands. Daniel Kemmis predicts, and I agree, that sooner or later some version of what happened to the country's welfare system in the 1990s is going to happen on public lands. When Congress abolished the old entrenched welfare system, it essentially acknowledged that the federal government was no longer the appropriate jurisdiction for this particular issue. It had lost its ability to deliver goods in a reliable and credible way. It had, in fact, suffered a fundamental loss of legitimacy in this arena. In the West, we are far down the road toward a similar loss of legitimacy on the part of the federal land management agencies, and we are witnessing a similar impulse to reform the federal system that controls and manages the millions of acres of Western land. It is time to start thinking seriously about what form that devolution of responsibility might take and how it can become a positive chapter of American and Western history. Again, quoting Daniel Kemmis, I would argue that only the West and its people can successfully and sustainably govern the West. The sooner Westerners understand that this is where the arrow of history is pointing, the sooner they can begin to control events instead of being controlled by them. I propose that we look toward the future. In doing so, I recommend that we find constructive ways to deal with the tensions in the short term, all the while seeking a long-term resolution that will leave the West sovereign over its own landscape. It's end quote. So like Kemmis, I believe the time has come for Westerners to begin joining hands and seriously consider across party lines an agenda for Western management of the public lands centered on the principle of self-determining sustainable prosperity. As we consider options like land swaps or even whole new land management paradigms as envisioned by people like Kemmis, and begin to think more on the landscape level, new tools are being developed to understand each region's diverse environmental and cultural values. Ever since the advent of geographic information systems, we have seen a remarkable proliferation of tools meant to help us better understand regions through visual tools richly embedded with multiple layers of data. That overlap data helps us to project values and priorities onto the map, offering powerful insights to those whose goal is balancing economic and conservation values. Now, because Governor Herbert is currently the chair of the Western Governors Association, with a focus on energy, I've been exposed to a number of these tools. A number of states are in the process of developing what they are called the Crucial Habitat Assessment Tools, or CHAT, which WGA is in the process of weaving together into a single regional tool that can help planners guide production, generation, and transmission development away from areas that offer high-value habitat to multiple species. In a parallel effort, the Western Electric Coordinating Council's Environmental Data Task Force is putting the final touches on a regional tool that maps cultural and historic data sets, as well as various protected lands, endangered and protection species habitat, etc. The idea is to guide project development according to the degree of potential development risk. As tools like these become more widely available and are truly integrated into the permitting and regulatory process, as well as in the allocation of mitigation funds, the conservation community will be empowered and the development process potentially streamlined. Having begun by talking about the valuable conservation work already being undertaken by various state agencies, I have yet to address what I see as the significant environmental promise offered by technological advances in energy production. While now I know it's a little cliche to talk about horizontal drilling, I think it is profound enough of a development in oil and gas production that I cannot avoid mentioning it. By allowing companies to drill multiple wells from a single pad, not only is each operation's footprint minimized, but the potential for various types of leaks and other such problems are likewise reduced. It is also true that sites thought to have been exhausted, at least to the extent economically feasible, have been revitalized through the combination of horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing. While this may not have initially struck conservationists as a good thing, when thought of as a comparable to the distinction between greenfield and brownfield development in urban areas, one begins to see the value that such technologies are offering. And another example of how technological advancement in production techniques is offering conservation benefits, I would like to highlight the beginning of a truly positive trend in the Uinta Basin. Certain industry leaders, Newfield, Anadarko, Bill Barrett, and others, have been investing remarkable amounts of capital into the centralization of storage for the water, oil, and gas that is produced across vast fields. By piping those products to a central collection point rather than smaller per pad tanks, the amount of vehicle traffic and associated emissions, both of which have negative impacts on species, are being dramatically reduced. Utah is often thought of as a business-friendly state, and while I certainly hope that that's true, I realize there are many folks here that may be somewhat a little more ambivalent about such friendliness. Let me remind folks that our business partners here in Utah that are actively developing our resources are also actively investing in the very mitigation efforts I mentioned earlier. Certainly they are businesses, and I'm not necessarily suggesting they are doing this out of the goodness of their hearts, but frankly that doesn't matter. The bottom line is that while these producers cannot help but have some environmental impact, at the same time they are augmenting and restoring habitat elsewhere, and so helping keep the balance. At the same time, industry is partnering proactively on the Uinta Basin Air Quality Study, which is being coordinated by a variety of stakeholders. Again, their involvement could certainly be characterized as demonstrating an instinct for self-preservation. But given how valuable these companies' activities and successes are to the state's economy, I have no problem viewing their engagement more charitably as an investment in the state's economic and environmental well-being. If you'll allow me, I would like to venture beyond conservation for a moment and speak to a few minutes about community impacts associated with development. Let's consider the energy boom underway in North Dakota. In a recent presentation to the Natural Resources, Agriculture, and Environment Interim Committees, I described how North Dakota's relatively low percentage of federal lands put it in an enviable position among energy-producing states. So as I described it at a recent interim committee hearing, North Dakota has a relatively low percentage of federal lands, or approximately 5% of their land, which puts them in an enviable position among energy-producing states. You know, at that hearing, I confessed that I was a little bit jealous, and in fact, I coveted the position of the energy advisor in the state of North Dakota because that person actually gets to set energy policy for the state of North Dakota. I have a much more difficult challenge here in the state of Utah. Of course, it's no drawback to be situated on top of a shale formation like the Bakken. But undoubtedly, the nature of land ownership in the state has also given North Dakota a great advantage, and it's an advantage that I envy. With that said, the rapid expansion of industry in such a short period of time has created social impacts within the state that present real challenges. These challenges include insufficient infrastructure, a lack of adequate housing stock in schools, a boom in crime, noise pollution, traffic congestion, the list goes on. So while I may envy the economic opportunity, hearing about these impacts to communities in North Dakota gives me some pause and strong reason to consider seriously the importance of proper planning. It is clear to me that more proactive community and regional planning is critical if states hope to reap the full social and economic benefit of industry growth. So what exactly does that entail? Community planning is no more my background than botany, but I'm going to give you a snapshot of what it could look like. First, I think that communities need to assess what it is about their communities that they value. Given the context, we are most talking about rural communities, so do these communities value the pace of living, the quiet, the safety, the connection to the land? Why is this sort of assessment important? Well, now we have the technical ability to project and analyze the impact of commercial activity and population growth on specific communities. Using that capability, we are able to evaluate a variety of community development scenarios, taking into account various degrees of urban density and other factors that are key to the character of a community. When we when we take these scenarios and hold them up against our established values and needs, we can begin to make development choices that reflect those values. What do we insist on keeping the same, and where are we willing to see growth and change? And that question gets to the fundamental underlying premise, which is that significant industry growth cannot happen without having a significant impact on the community. However, my message today is that those impacts don't have to be negative. If we can anticipate the pressure of growth and channel it in a way that reflects the will of the community, we'll see positive outcomes here in Utah. I believe this means that a focus on education and workforce development. It'll also mean proactive community infrastructure planning, close, possibly denser housing development designed in a way that's sensitive to the community's rural character. It will mean possibly providing the amenities like parks, restaurants, and retail that a growing population will demand. And it will also mean providing forums and institutions through which the community may mediate the tension between the original community and the newcomers. This sort of community planning is sometimes beyond the capacity of rural communities in terms of staff expertise and staff time, as well as the mapping software, graphic software, and other visualization tools. But the state is willing to partner with counties and municipalities to create a path forward, whether that means working with the state experts or reaching out to regional planning organizations or consultants, groups like Envision Utah. Partnerships with industry will also be important in these communities because these large companies know that healthy communities are important to the long-term sustainability of their operations, not to mention their ability to attract the best and the brightest to work for them. So these companies are natural partners, and local leaders should not hesitate to reach out to them for collaboration and support as they work to create a more livable community. Finally, I think I want to end with a request. I know that energy companies are spending money to adopt and refine best management practices on their sites, and that they are also spending mitigation dollars on other sites and throughout the region. I know that communities are working through environmental and social issues related to the expansion in energy production, and that they have largely welcomed that growth. When it comes to expanded resource development and community growth, there will always be a balance of pros and cons, benefits and costs, economy and environment. Right now here in Utah, again, as I said earlier, my impression is that we're doing pretty well and we're on the right path. However, while we are taking care of the environment and our communities today, I think we haven't yet learned to tell that story. The dialogue about energy is often controlled by those furthest removed from its true impacts, both negative and positive, and that is something we need to change. As the energy advisor to Governor Herbert, I am happy to hear those stories, and I'd like to offer up the Office of Energy Development as another outlet and as a key player in the energy future of the state of Utah. In conclusion, the balance between energy development and biodiversity is not a myth or a hoax like political science. I believe it truly can be found. However, I believe that the proper balance is much more likely to occur under a new framework of local, collaborative decision-making rather than through the current paradigm of a gridlocked and rigid federal land and regulatory policies. The future is very exciting, and for a number of reasons, I believe that Utah is going to be on the vanguard of this renewed effort to find the right balance between energy development and protecting our natural environment. Thank you for your time.